So in this final lecture about skeletal muscle, we are going to start talking about some intricacies related to contractions. So first of all, in the last lecture, I kind of said this but glossed over it. When the alpha motor neuron generates one action potential, that always results in the skeletal muscle fiber generating one action potential. By that I mean the action potential from the alpha motor neuron is always passed to the skeletal muscle fiber. Now you know that doesn't happen with neurons. Like if one neuron generates an action potential, that one action potential is never going to get another neuron to threshold. Right? If a presynaptic neuron generates one action potential, the postsynaptic neuron is not going to get to threshold. The electrical impulse, the wave of positivity, the depolarization, whatever, right, it's not going to be sufficient by the time that it gets to the hillock, right? It'll decrement too much because it's a graded potential, and by the time that that electrical impulse gets to the hillock, it'll fall apart too much, and the postsynaptic neuron won't generate an action potential. That's not true for this interaction here, for this synapse. When alpha motor neurons generate an action potential, they always, 100% of the time, pass that one action potential to the skeletal muscle fiber. There are many explanations for why this is the case. Some of it deals with the motor end plate and the way that it's organized and the number of acetylcholine receptors that there are. And a big part of it is what we actually went over in the lecture, and that is the voltage-gated sodium channels within the skeletal muscle fiber plasma membrane lie right next to where the motor end plate is, like right next to the skeletal muscle fiber plasma membrane that's underneath the axon terminal button. So that depolarization underneath the end plate right here only needs to travel a very short distance, right? That electrical impulse only needs to travel from right underneath the end plate, the axon terminal button, to right adjacent to the motor end plate is the portion of the plasma membrane where the voltage-gated sodium channels are located, right? So the depolarization has to travel a very short distance, and thus it very easily depolarizes that area to threshold. The point basically is that this electrical impulse that's generated, the depolarization underneath the motor end plate, it doesn't really have time to decrement. Like in a neuron, you have to get that electrical impulse all the way from the dendritic region to the hillock, like 1/3 of the way across the neuron. Here, the depolarization, this wave of positivity, right? All it has to do is travel to the very next region, adjacent region of the muscle fiber, and thus the signal really doesn't decrement much at all, and it depolarizes that region that's next to the end plate very easily to threshold, and thus the voltage-gated sodium channels open up and an action potential propagates down the skeletal muscle fiber. That alone was already a little bit more of a long-winded explanation than I wanted to give, because there's actually much more to explaining this than what I went through with you. All you need to know is that every single time an alpha motor neuron generates an action potential, that action potential is passed to the skeletal muscle fiber, and the skeletal muscle fiber generates an action potential. And additionally, if the alpha motor neuron generates 10 action potentials, then the skeletal muscle fiber will generate 10 action potentials. Just keep that in the back of your mind for now. Now, I just went over that because it's very important to this next conversation. Let's pretend that the alpha motor neuron generates one action potential. It's going to pass that one action potential to the skeletal muscle fiber, and the skeletal muscle fiber will generate one action potential. And that one action potential that the skeletal muscle fiber generates will result in something that we call a twitch. The skeletal muscle fiber will perform or generate a twitch. Now, what is a twitch? A twitch is a very short-lived and submaximal contraction. Let's take a look at it. So this is a graph of a muscle fiber twitch. On the y-axis, you have tension or force, and on the x-axis, you have time. Okay, so here's what happens. First of all, there's a stimulus. What a stimulus means is the skeletal muscle fiber generates an action potential, right? And the skeletal muscle fiber generates an action potential, and then there's a delay between when that action potential is generated and when the skeletal muscle fiber actually begins to generate force, right? So what is force? When myosin and actin are actually interacting with each other. So why is there a delay between when an action potential is generated and when force actually is seen within the muscle fiber, right? Why is there this time delay? And the answer is obvious, right? If the skeletal muscle fiber generates an action potential, the action potential has to propagate down the plasma membrane, propagate down the T tubule, then the DHP receptors have to open, which open the ryanodine receptors, calcium floods out, binds to troponin, and then finally myosin and actin can interact with each other, okay? That takes a little bit of time. It's measured in milliseconds, millionths of a second. But nonetheless, like it takes a couple milliseconds in order for that process to play out, right? The muscle fiber can't generate force until tropomyosin is wound off of actin and myosin and actin can interact. So it's not like as soon as the muscle fiber generates an action potential, force can be generated. You have to wait for the action potential to travel down the plasma membrane, down the T tubule, allow calcium out, calcium to bind to troponin, and then myosin and actin to interact, right? So that process takes a little bit of time to play out, a couple millionths of a second. And that is where this time delay is coming from. It's called the latent period. It's the period of time between when an action potential is generated by a skeletal muscle fiber and it actually begins to generate force. And the period of time is that delay, that period of time where the action potential has been generated but force hasn't begun to be generated by the muscle fiber yet, is just the process playing out of the action potential, again, propagating down the membrane into the T tubule, causing calcium to be released, and thus then finally allowing for myosin and actin to interact, and then you begin to see the contraction phase. Okay, so then you see the contraction phase. The contraction phase is myosin and actin interacting, obviously. The more myosin and actin interacting, the more force you will get. Right? Force is proportional to the number of myosin heads bound to actin. That is abundantly clear in skeletal muscle fiber research. The more myosin and actin you have bound together, the more force you will get. So over time, as more myosin and actin interact, there is more force that is produced, which is clearly depicted, right, in the graph. But then you get to this peak level of force, which is actually, as you're about to see, submaximal, and then relaxation begins, right? Force begins to decrease. And why is that? Because the calcium is being kicked from the intracellular fluid, the cytosol, back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and now there's less calcium bound to troponin, and thus less myosin and actin are interacting, so less force is being produced, and the muscle fiber is beginning to relax, right? The muscle fiber is generating less force due to less interactions of myosin and actin. This is a muscle fiber twitch, this image right here. You'll see this a lot in different textbooks and research studies. Now, the big thing about a twitch, besides the different phases, great to know the different phases, but really the big thing to realize about a twitch is that the amount of force that the skeletal muscle fiber generates is submaximal. It's nowhere near the maximal amount of force that the muscle fiber is capable of generating. We'll look at a graph in a minute here, but I mean, it would be way up here, right? This is how much force the muscle fiber could generate, and this is how much force it did generate with a twitch. Muscle fiber twitches are always submaximal force. This is just text form of the different phases of the twitch that we went through. And this brings us to the discussion of what's called twitch, summation, and tetanus. Okay? It's looking at how an individual skeletal muscle fiber is capable of generating more and ultimately peak force. Let me show you something real quick. Here's a twitch, right? You can see the whole process of the twitch playing out. Right? It looks just like the graph that we just looked at. There's the twitch. And over here on the right, we'll talk about how we get here in a minute, but over here on the right is something called tetanus, which is when the skeletal muscle fiber generates maximal sustained force. Okay, look at the difference. Here's how much force is generated during a twitch when the skeletal muscle fiber generates one action potential. And over here is how much force it's actually capable of generating. You can come back over here and you can see, well, I went down a little bit, but you can see that the skeletal muscle fiber is capable of generating way more force than it actually does during a twitch. For the millionth time, a twitch happens when a skeletal muscle fiber generates one action potential. The skeletal muscle fiber clearly generates significant submaximal force. Right? It's really submaximal. It has the ability to generate way more force than it does during a twitch. So how do we get the skeletal muscle fiber to generate maximal force? Something that we call tetanus. And that requires a bit of a more detailed conversation, so let's do that. So let's first address why an alpha motor neuron passing one action potential to the skeletal muscle fiber doesn't allow the skeletal muscle fiber to generate maximal force. Okay? So the skeletal muscle fiber here generates one action potential. What happens? The action potential travels down the plasma membrane, down the T-tubule. That causes calcium to be released. Calcium binds to troponin, and then myosin and actin interact. Force happens. But then immediately, there are some really interesting advanced physiological explanations for why this happens. But immediately, upon calcium being released, calcium begins to be reuptaken. Calcium itself, actually, when it elevates in the intracellular fluid, the cytosol, it binds to and actually activates the circupumps. The more calcium in the cell, the more active the circupumps actually become. And this happens immediately. So the point is, if you don't remember the circupumps, those are the pumps on the SR, sarcoendoplasmic reticulum calcium ATPase pumps. The primary active transport pumps that take calcium and pump it back into the SR. Let's just say the more calcium there is inside of the skeletal muscle fiber, the intracellular fluid, the more active these pumps are, and the more calcium is being pumped back into the SR. So this is the point. One action potential is going to cause some calcium to be released from the SR, as is being depicted in this image. But then immediately, that calcium is going to get kicked right back into the SR. So the point is, way before all of the available troponin sites have calcium bound to them, calcium gets kicked back into the SR. Think about it. If you want maximal force, what do you need? You need the maximal number of myosin heads bound to actin. That's how you get peak force. Force is proportional to the number of myosin heads bound to actin. So if you want the muscle fiber to generate maximal force, you need the most amount of myosin heads possible to be bound to actin. That's how you get peak force. Well, how are you going to allow that to happen? Well, what are you going to need? You're going to need all of this calcium that's in the muscle fiber to be bound to all of the available troponin. So all of the tropomyosin will be wound off of actin, and that will allow then all of the available myosin and actin to be able to interact. And what I'm saying is that doesn't happen, right? The calcium that's released, some of it will bind to some troponin, right? But it won't have time to bind to all of the troponin inside of the skeletal muscle fiber, only a portion of it. And the reason that it doesn't have enough time to bind to all of the available troponin, the reason that calcium doesn't have enough time to bind to all of the available troponin, is because the calcium gets kicked right back into the SR again, right? So because of this, the skeletal muscle fiber doesn't generate anywhere near maximal force. And you can probably work this problem out in your head. If the problem is as soon as calcium is released, the calcium gets reuptaken, and thus not enough calcium is able to bind to enough troponin to allow the most amount of myosin and actin to interact, and that's the reason that the skeletal muscle fiber doesn't generate maximal force. How can we resolve this issue? The clear answer is you need the calcium levels to stay sustained inside of the intracellular fluid, or elevate inside of the intracellular fluid, even better. If somehow we can get the calcium to elevate and stay sustained in the intracellular fluid, the cytosol, then the calcium will have time to bind to all of the available troponin, and thus all of the available myosin will be able to bind to actin, and we'll get maximal force. So how do we resolve the issue? Well, what we need is for the alpha motor neuron to generate more action potentials. Let's say over the course of a second, the alpha motor neuron now generates 5 action potentials. What that means is if the alpha motor neuron generates 5 action potentials over the course of 1 second, then the skeletal muscle fiber will generate 5 action potentials over the course of 1 second, right? That's a very, very important thing to realize, right? Because for every action potential that's generated by the alpha motor neuron, the skeletal muscle fiber will generate an action potential. So if the alpha motor neuron generates 5 action potentials a second, the skeletal muscle fiber will generate 5 action potentials a second. And how is that going to influence force production? Well, every single time that the skeletal muscle fiber generates an action potential, it releases calcium from its sarcoplasmic reticulum. I hope that part makes sense. The action potential will travel down the T-tubule, open up the DHP and thus ryanodine receptors, because the DHP receptor opened the ryanodine receptors, and calcium will flood out. So for every action potential the skeletal muscle fiber generates, it releases some calcium from its SR, sarcoplasmic reticulum. If it does that 5 times over the course of 1 second, meaning if the skeletal muscle fiber generates 5 action potentials over the course of 1 second, it will release calcium 5 times over the course of 1 second from the SR. Now, some of this, this is another one of a million things. Like if you pick up a medical physiology textbook, you're going to find out it's about 1,400 pages long. Okay, you could spend an entire semester talking about 30 of those pages if you wanted to, easily. So a lot of these things, it requires some glossing over to be able to get through, and that's exactly what I have to do here as well. This isn't a complete answer, but if the SR releases this calcium 5 times, what essentially begins to happen is that calcium stays elevated or begins to build somewhat in the intracellular fluid. Another way that you could say this is that calcium released from the SR begins to exceed the reuptake, meaning that more calcium is being released from the SR than calcium is being reuptaken by the SR. So what's going to begin to happen, obviously, to the amount of calcium in the intracellular fluid? It's going to begin to build to some degree. Let's remember how we got here. The alpha motor neuron generated 5 action potentials over the course of 1 second. Over the course of 1 second, the alpha motor neuron generated 5 action potentials, and thus the skeletal muscle fiber generated 5 action potentials over the course of 1 second. Okay. That means the skeletal muscle fiber is releasing calcium from its SR 5 times over the course of 1 second. That calcium that's being released is also being reuptaken by the SR, right? But because of the frequency by which calcium is being released, the rate at which calcium is being released is beginning to exceed the rate at which the calcium is being reuptaken. And thus, the muscle fiber will begin to generate more force. Why? Because if calcium begins to build inside of the fiber, then more calcium will bind to more troponin, more tropomyosin will be unwound off of actin, and more myosin and actin will interact, and thus you will get more force. But the problem is you're not going to still, in this instance, get maximal force. The skeletal muscle fiber generating, there's no skeletal muscle fiber in the body that we know of. Like if it generates 5 action potentials over the course of a second, we call that 5 hertz. That's how we study that in a lab. If a skeletal muscle fiber, any type of skeletal muscle fiber, slow twitch, fast twitch, whatever, if it only generates 5 action potentials over the course of a second, it's still not going to generate max force. There's no way. There's no chance. It'll generate more force than if it were to only receive 1 action potential, but it's still not going to generate maximal force. Generating gradually more force due to a higher frequency of action potential is something called summation. What we're going to see here is summation of force. The muscle fiber will begin to generate more force, but it still won't generate maximal force. And the reason for this is very complex, and some of which we don't even fully understand. But basically, the intervals between the action potentials, right? So if there's 5 action potentials per second, in physiological terms, those are pretty long intervals between the action potentials. Like 5 action potentials in 1 second is actually not very much at all. We know that there are, there are muscle cells that can generate hundreds of action potentials over the course of a second easily. Okay, so 5 action potentials over the course of 1 second might seem like a lot to you, but it's actually not that much. There are big breaks time-wise, big intervals between the action potentials. So here's action potential 1, here's action potential 2, here's 3, here's 4, here's 5. These are the intervals that I'm talking about, right? If time is on the x-axis down here, okay? These intervals here between the action potentials are relatively long. And what's happening during those intervals between the action potentials is actually lots of calcium is being reuptaken by the SR, and actually the muscle fiber is beginning to relax. The thing is, though, not all the calcium within the intracellular fluid is being reuptaken before the next action potential gets there. Okay, so it's like this. The skeletal muscle fiber generates action potential number 1. It releases calcium, right, into the muscle fiber. Calcium begins to bind to troponin, and myosin and actin begin to interact. And then the calcium begins to be reuptaken at a pretty fast rate. Before all the calcium can be reuptaken, another action potential happens, and more calcium is being released, right? So not all the calcium in the muscle fiber was able to be reuptaken before more calcium was released. See what we're seeing here? The release of calcium is exceeding the reuptake of calcium. So calcium is going to begin to build or stay sustained inside of the fiber. And now more calcium will bind to more troponin, and more myosin and actin will interact, and we'll begin to get more force. But the thing is, between the now second and third action potential, because I talked about action potential number 1, I talked about action potential number 2, right? Action potential 2 gets there before all the calcium gets reuptaken, and then more calcium gets released. But now there's, again, a pretty long interval between action potential number 2 and action potential number 3. And lots of calcium begins to be reuptaken by the SR, and relaxation actually begins. And then action potential number 3 gets there, and more calcium gets released. With action potential number 3, again, calcium will be released before all the calcium can be reuptaken. And by consequence, right, calcium levels will begin to build a little bit more and stay sustained inside of the fiber. So more force will be able to be generated again. But yet again, between action potential number 3 and action potential number 4 over the course of 1 second, it's too long of an interval, and a lot of the calcium will begin to be reuptaken again, because the thing that I mentioned is, I could go on, I can speak too much about this, and it's dangerous, so I've got to wrap this up. When calcium levels begin to elevate, the rate at which calcium can be reuptaken by the SR also increases. So there's so many things that you have to consider here. And the point that I'm trying to make is, between action potential 3 and action potential number 4, a lot of the calcium gets reuptaken by the SR, and relaxation begins to happen again inside of the muscle fiber. But then another action potential happens, and then some more calcium is released, and it begins to, accumulate and stay sustained and build. And you get more force than you did compared to when action potential number 3 arrived. This process that you're seeing here is called summation. Let's take a look at what that actually looks like. This is summation. You can see that the force is building, right? Here was the first, what we would call twitch, right? The muscle fiber was generating a twitch. It received one action potential, but then another action potential comes along before all the calcium can be reuptaken. So you see what happens here? You have the contraction phase, and then the relaxation phase begins. Let's change the color. You have the contraction phase, and then the relaxation phase begins. That's because the calcium is being reuptaken. But then another action potential arrives, and more calcium is released before all the calcium can be reuptaken, and calcium builds inside of the fiber, stays sustained, and with that second action potential, more calcium can bind to more troponin than during the first action potential, because now calcium is again staying sustained. It's building inside of the muscle fiber, and thus you can get more force. But then between the second and the third action potential, the interval is too long, and you get relaxation that begins to set in again. But before all the calcium can be reuptaken, another action potential arrives, and now even more calcium is elevated and sustained inside of the muscle fiber, and thus even more force can be generated because more calcium can bind to more troponin. But here's the issue. As long as, this is what lab experiments show us at least, as long as the intervals between the action potentials are long enough that the calcium can, begin to be reuptaken at a significant rate, and relaxation can begin between the action potentials arriving, you're never really going to get maximal force. Yes, the subsequent action potentials that are arriving before all the calcium can be reuptaken is causing more calcium to be released, and more calcium to build, and more calcium to bind to troponin, and more myosin and actin to interact. So you're getting more force every time due to this accumulation and sustaining of calcium inside of the fiber. But you're never going to get maximal force unless you can get a very high frequency of action potentials. And let's take a look at that. That will lead to tetanus. This varies significantly between muscle fiber types. talk about these very briefly in this course, but we have what are called slow twitch fibers, kind of intermediate twitch fibers, fast twitch fibers, and how many action potentials they need to generate to actually get into a state of tetanus is highly dependent upon the fiber that you're talking about. But of the slowest twitch fibers that we know of, these fibers, we'll talk about them, like I said, in just a minute here, they need at least like 20 to 25 hertz to get into a state of tetanus, which means that the alpha motor neuron actually needs to generate between 20 and 25 action potentials per second, which would cause the muscle fiber to generate between 20 and 25 action potentials a second, right? Because for every action potential generated by the alpha motor neuron, the skeletal muscle fiber generates an action potential. So if the skeletal muscle fiber can generate, let's say at minimally 20 action potentials per second, then you will get into a state of tetanus. Basically, that means that the skeletal muscle fiber will generate maximal force, right? It'll generate the absolute most amount of force that it's possible of generating. And you think, why is that? Okay, if the skeletal muscle fiber generates 20 action potentials per second, that means that it's releasing calcium 20 times from its SR over the course of 1 second. If the skeletal muscle fiber, and in this case, again, we're talking what is called a very, very slow twitch muscle fiber. If the skeletal muscle fiber can generate 20 action potentials over the course of 1 second and release calcium, thus 20 times from its SR over the course of 1 second, then the intervals between the action potentials are so short that the rate at which calcium is being reuptaken by the SR is basically meaningless. That doesn't mean the SR stops reuptaking calcium, because it absolutely continues to reuptake calcium. But the point is, the rate at which calcium is being released, the frequency by which calcium is being released from the SR, is so frequent that the rate of calcium reuptake by the SR basically becomes obsolete. There's not nearly enough time between the action potential intervals for any meaningful amount of calcium to be reuptaken by the SR and begin the process of relaxation. So basically what you get is you get calcium that just builds inside of the fiber basically indefinitely. Calcium just stays sustained and keeps building and building and building. And what you get is there's such a sustained, elevated amount of calcium inside of the muscle fiber that all of the available troponin inside of the muscle fiber have calcium bound to it, and thus all of the tropomycins unwind off of actin, and all of the available myosin heads bind to actin, and the fiber generates maximal force. That's something that we refer to as tetanus. Maximal force by a muscle fiber is called tetanus. To get the muscle fiber into a state of tetanus, sustained maximal force, what has to be done is a very high frequency of action potentials has to be passed to the muscle fiber by the alpha motor neuron. And that causes then the muscle fiber to generate a high frequency of action potentials and release a very high frequency of, let's say this a little bit more eloquently. That high frequency of action potentials that the muscle fiber generates causes it to essentially release so much more calcium from its SR that it can reuptake. That the calcium pretty much, like I said, indefinitely stays elevated and sustained inside of the muscle fiber with no relaxation that occurs whatsoever. Because the time intervals between the action potentials are so short that the amount of calcium being reuptaken by the SR is, again, obsolete. And I need to say this, although I'm not going to really be able to explain it. We have different muscle fiber types, and if you get into like a really fast twitch muscle fiber, 20 action potentials per second, it'll do nothing. Like, it'll cause the muscle fiber to the force to summate a little bit, right? It'll produce a little bit more force than what it would with a twitch, but it will not move into a state of tetanus. It won't be anywhere near tetanus. the intervals are between the action potentials are much too long still, and that all goes back to a really detailed physiological conversation about the rate at which faster fibers are able to reuptake calcium into their SRs. So what you need to do is you actually need to pass a much higher frequency of action potentials to the faster twitch fibers. It can be as high as 300 action potentials per second to get very fast twitch fibers into a state of tetanus. I just want you to be aware that this can't be applied the same exact thing to every muscle fiber type in the human body. It just doesn't work. All I want you to get out of this is to see what twitch, summation, and tetanus is. Right? It's all about how do we get a muscle fiber to generate maximal force. And I hope when you look at something like this, you now know what it's showing you. Right? Here's a twitch, one action potential, really submaximal force. Here's summation. That's when the skeletal muscle fiber begins to generate a higher frequency of action potentials, thanks to the alpha motor neuron. But the time intervals between the action potentials are still too long. So in between the action potentials, calcium begins to be reuptaken, and relaxation begins to set in. And as long as that's going on, then you really can't get to what we call true tetanus. The muscle fiber will begin to generate more force because with each action potential that arrives, more calcium will be released, and a little bit more calcium will elevate, and a little bit more calcium will bind to more troponin, and more myosin will interact. But between the action potentials, the time interval is too long, and a lot of that calcium will begin to be reuptaken, and again you'll begin to see relaxation set in between the action potentials. So you really can never get to true tetanus, maximal force that's sustained. In order to do that, you have to pass you see all the arrows there, those are all supposed to be action potentials, although it would technically be much, much more than that, for even the slowest twitch fiber. To get to a state of tetanus, the muscle fiber has to generate a very high frequency of action potentials. And of course, that's a product of the alpha motor neuron passing those action potentials to it. It has to generate such a high frequency of action potentials that the time intervals between the action potentials are so short that relaxation by no means has any chance of setting in. Basically, what I'm saying is the intervals between the action potentials are so short that the rate that calcium is being reuptaken by the SR becomes meaningless. And then calcium just elevates and stays sustained, like I said, kind of indefinitely inside of the muscle fiber, and all of the available calcium binds to all of the available troponin, and the most amount of myosin and actin can interact, and you get peak force. Now, of course, this is indefinite only because of, well, we don't know when it's going to end. But we do know, I say it's indefinite because it depends upon the circumstance, obviously. But if you want to bring it to an end, what do? The alpha motor neuron just needs to stop generating action potentials. If the alpha motor neuron stops generating action potentials, then the skeletal muscle fiber will stop generating action potentials, and it'll stop releasing calcium from its SR, and the calcium will be reuptaken by the SR, and you will get relaxation. Okay, that's what brings tetanus to an end. It's when the skeletal muscle fiber stops generating action potentials because the alpha motor neuron stops generating action potentials. So now we've discussed how individual muscle fibers can produce more force, how they can produce maximal force, right? It's all about the number of action potentials that they generate and thus the amount of calcium that they release. Although there is another huge question, which is how does a whole muscle generate more force? So here's the biceps muscle. Inside of the biceps muscle, we know there are hundreds of thousands of muscle fibers. Here's one of them. And we've only been talking about how individual fibers can generate more force, right, through summation and tetanus. So That's great, but what about the whole muscle? Like, how does the whole biceps muscle produce more force? Well, one, if the muscle fibers within the biceps muscle that are contracting are in a state of tetanus, that's going to help the whole biceps muscle generate more force, obviously. I mean, the more force that the individual fibers that are in the biceps muscle that are contracting, the more force that those fibers are producing, the more force the whole biceps muscle will produce. But that's a smaller factor in reality that will determine how much that's a smaller factor with regard to what will really determine how much force the whole biceps muscle produces. What will really determine the amount of force that the biceps muscle produces is the number of muscle fibers within the biceps muscle contracting. That's what has the biggest influence over how much force a whole muscle produces, compared to are the muscle fibers that are contracting in that muscle in a state of tetanus. You're going to see that a lot of the time, the muscle fibers that are recruited are really kind of already in a state of tetanus. This doesn't apply all the time, as you will see. But generally speaking, especially the slower twitch fibers within the muscle fiber that are actually, as you're going to see, recruited first, when they're recruited, they're kind of already in a state of tetanus. They're already generating enough action potentials to be contracting in a state of tetanus. So if just naturally, if when a lot of the muscle fibers within a whole muscle are recruited, they're already in a state of tetanus, that's not going to be having the biggest influence over the amount of force that the whole muscle produces. The biggest thing that's going to influence the amount of force that the whole muscle produces is ultimately the number of muscle fibers within that muscle that are contracting. If only 10,000 muscle fibers out of 350,000 are contracting, that's not very many, right? The way that you would probably want to get the whole biceps muscle to generate more force would just be to simply cause more muscle fibers to contract. Let's try to get 200,000 muscle fibers within the biceps muscle to contract rather than 10,000. If you have 200,000 muscle fibers all contracting within the biceps muscle, then the biceps muscle is going to be able to generate way more force as a whole compared to if only 10,000 muscle fibers within it were contracting. So to understand how we can change the number of muscle fibers contracting within a whole muscle, and thus change the amount of force that it's producing, either to make it produce more or less force, you have to understand some anatomy. We've said many times throughout this course that whole muscles have hundreds of thousands or even millions of muscle fibers within them. Let's keep on the same track that we've been on. Here's the biceps muscle. Within the biceps muscle, there are, let's say, between 200,000 and 400,000 muscle fibers. Okay. What's being depicted here is one alpha motor neuron. That's all we've ever been talking about so far. And you're seeing that one alpha motor neuron. Its cell body and dendrite is in the spinal cord. Its axon travels through a nerve, the musculocutaneous nerve, and then its axon terminals reach the biceps muscle and synapse with a given number of muscle fibers. In this example, the alpha motor neuron is synapsing with 2 muscle fibers, but that's really not going to happen. It's probably going to be somewhere between 50 and 100. Somewhere between 50 and 1,000 muscle fibers, minimally 50. You're not going to have an alpha motor neuron that travels out to the biceps muscle and only synapses with 2 muscle fibers. That never happens, okay? But the thing is, if that alpha motor neuron travels out to the biceps muscle and let's say synapses with 500 muscle fibers, every single time that alpha motor neuron generates an action potential, it's going to pass an action potential to the 500 muscle fibers that it synapses with, and those 500 muscle fibers within the biceps muscle are going to contract, okay? But that's only 500 muscle fibers. Let's say there's 350,000 muscle fibers within the biceps muscle. That's a lot more than 500, okay? So what must be going on here? Well, there must be other alpha motor neurons that travel through the same nerve out to the same muscle, and there is, and that's what this image is trying to show you. Here's another alpha motor neuron in red. Its cell body and its dendrite are in the exact same region of the spinal cord as the other alpha motor neuron that we just discussed. its axon travels through the exact same nerve, the musculocutaneous nerve, out to the biceps muscle. And when it gets to the biceps muscle, it synapses with 3 muscle fibers in the biceps muscle. In reality, again, like I said, it's probably going to be between like 50 and 1,000. Let's say that it synapses with another 500 muscle fibers. So now, well, we're starting to resolve the issue now, because now we've got 2 alpha motor neurons, each synapsing with 500 muscle fibers, and that brings us to 1,000. But we still have a huge issue. There are, in my example, 350,000 muscle fibers within the biceps muscle. And right now, we're only showing the synapse, of 1,000 of them, right? There's 350,000 muscle fibers within the biceps muscle. Every single one of them has to synapse with an alpha motor neuron, otherwise those muscle fibers won't be able to contract. And so far, I've only shown, I realize the image only shows 5, but I'm pretending that each one of them synapses with 500. So we've only shown the synapse that 1,000 of them have. We've still got 349,000 muscle fibers to go. Where are the alpha motor neurons that hook up with those? And the answer is, well, there's hundreds of alpha motor neurons that all travel through the musculocutaneous nerve out to the biceps muscle, right? You're going to find hundreds of cell bodies and dendrites in this region of the spinal cord. And what I'm saying is you're going to find hundreds of cell bodies and dendrites of alpha motor neurons in this region of the spinal cord. And you're going to find hundreds of axons that all travel through the musculocutaneous nerve. And then when these axons get to the biceps muscle, they're going to turn into axon terminals. And each one of these axons, and thus alpha motor neurons, is going to synapse with, like I said, somewhere between probably 50 and 1,000 muscle fibers within the biceps muscle. Right? And you're going to have enough alpha motor neurons that actually travel out to the biceps muscle so that all 350,000 muscle fibers within the biceps muscle have an alpha motor neuron that synapses with them. This is the point I'm trying to make. And this is true for every whole muscle in the human body. Pick like any muscle. One of the calf muscles, quadricep, hamstring, deltoid, whatever, lat muscles. You're going to have a nerve that travels out to that muscle. And there's going to be hundreds or thousands of alpha motor neurons that travel through that nerve. And each one of those alpha motor neurons is going to synapse with a given number of muscle fibers within that muscle until all the muscle fibers within that muscle have an alpha motor neuron that synapses with them. And that leads us into the discussion of the size principle. This anatomical organization is what's going to allow us to manipulate the number of muscle fibers contracting within a muscle. Because imagine this. Imagine that there's 500 alpha motor neurons that travel out to the biceps muscle. Okay? If only 30 of those alpha motor neurons are generating action potentials, then only action potentials will be being passed to the muscle fibers that synapse with those 30 alpha motor neurons. And none of the other muscle fibers within the biceps muscle are going to be receiving action potentials and thus contracting. So the biceps muscle isn't going to be producing much force if only 30 out of the 500 alpha motor neurons that travel out to it are generating action potentials. So if you want the biceps muscle to have more muscle fibers within it contract, and you want the biceps muscle if you want the biceps muscle to produce more force, then what do you need? You need more of the 500 alpha motor neurons to generate action potentials, to pass more action potentials to more muscle fibers within the biceps muscle, and you'll get more force production because more muscle fibers within the biceps muscle will contract. Okay. If this has been a little bit confusing to you, that's fine, because we're about to lay out the whole process in detail here. This is the actual image that your textbook uses that I really don't like. This is an alpha motor neuron. You can see it should be traveling through a nerve, and it's going out to a particular muscle. and then it's synapsing with a given number of muscle fibers. And here's another alpha motor neuron, which should be in the exact same region of the spinal cord, and its axon should be traveling through the same nerve, synapsing with a given number of muscle fibers within a whole muscle. Okay, so both of these alpha motor neurons should be in the same exact region of the spinal cord. They should be traveling through the same nerve out to the same muscle, just synapsing with a different number of muscle fibers each. Now, just real quick, this is just a definitional thing. This is never something that I would harp on. But the term motor unit, what it means is it means the alpha motor neuron plus all the muscle fibers in the muscle that it synapses with. So, you know, a motor unit in this example would be, if we said motor unit number one would include this alpha motor neuron and the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 muscle fibers that it synapses with. Okay, that's what a motor unit is. It's great if you know that a motor unit is the alpha motor neuron and all the muscle fibers that it synapses with, but I'm actually probably not going to use that term overly frequently in this course. So this is the image from your textbook that we're going to use to discuss the size principle. It is kind of simultaneously great and awful at the same time. Your text manages to do that a lot. So what the size principle is it's the discussion of how do we change the number of muscle fibers within a whole muscle contracting and thus change the amount of force that the whole muscle is producing. And to make sense of that, you need to look at an image like this. Neuron W here is the neuron from the primary motor cortex. Why they have neuron W located in what would basically be the brainstem, I have no clue, right? Neuron W should be up in the primary motor cortex, right? In the cerebral cortex right in front, the portion of the cerebral cortex right in front of the central sulcus. And what you're seeing, we'll call this the primary motor cortex neuron, okay, PMC. Its axon travels down the spinal cord. And let's say that this is one of the primary motor cortex neurons that's involved in activating biceps muscle fibers. So the primary motor cortex neuron must travel down the spinal cord, and in the spinal cord, where's it going to terminate? In the cervical region. And in the cervical region, the primary motor cortex neuron is going to synapse with many more than just one alpha motor neuron. Okay, one primary motor cortex neuron, and it doesn't just have to be the one that controls the biceps muscle. One primary motor cortex neuron will often synapse with hundreds or thousands of alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord. What's only being shown here is 3, which is fine, right? Because again, we're simplifying. But we're going to pretend that this is the, we want to contract the biceps muscle, okay? We want to contract the biceps muscle, and we're going to talk about how we can vary the amount of force that the biceps muscle produces. So if we want to contract the biceps muscle, we know from prior discussions that we're first of all going to need the neurons up in the primary motor cortex that control the activation of the alpha motor neurons that travel out to the biceps muscle to start generating action potentials. So we need this primary motor cortex neuron to start generating action potentials. And then we have to realize that this primary motor cortex neuron, its axon, travels into the cervical region of the spinal cord, and it actually synapses with many alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord that travel through the musculocutaneous nerve out to the biceps muscle. And that's the second huge error that this image has. Okay, these alpha motor neurons should all be located in the exact same region of the spinal cord. These alpha motor neurons should all be located in the cervical region of the spinal cord. And their axons should all be traveling through the exact same nerve, the musculocutaneous nerve, out to the biceps muscle. All of these muscle fibers are muscle fibers that exist within the biceps muscle. Okay? That's what you have to pretend. Otherwise, the image doesn't work at all. It makes absolutely no sense, actually. It's terrible. You have to pretend that all of these alpha motor neurons, right, are located in the cervical region of the spinal cord. And you have to pretend that all of their axons are traveling out through the same nerve and thus going to the same muscle. They just innervate or synapse with different numbers of muscle fibers. Okay, so for example, alpha motor neuron X travels through the musculocutaneous nerve, reaches the biceps muscle, and synapses with 3 muscle fibers. Alpha motor neuron Y travels through the musculocutaneous nerve and synapses with 5 muscle fibers. Alpha motor neuron Z travels through the musculocutaneous nerve and synapses with 7 muscle fibers within the biceps muscle. In all of them, alpha motor neuron X, alpha motor neuron Y, and alpha motor neuron Z have action potentials passed to them by the primary motor cortex neuron, right? The primary motor cortex neuron, starts in the primary motor cortex. This is the one that's involved in controlling the activation of the biceps. This primary motor cortex neuron, you can see it synapses with alpha motor neuron X, alpha motor neuron Y, and alpha motor neuron Z. So that's the first part of this that you've got to get in your head. You have to pretend that this is drawn a little bit differently than it is. You have to pretend it looks like this. Okay? Alpha motor neuron Y, X, and Z are all going to be in the same region of the spinal cord, and their axons are going to be traveling through the same nerve out to the same muscle where they all synapse with different numbers of muscle fibers. Okay? And then there would be a primary motor cortex neuron that would be synapsing with all 3 of them. Okay, that's what you've got to pretend. So this is called the size principle. And where does that come from? It's because the alpha motor neurons are different sizes. You'll notice that alpha motor neuron X is quite small, meaning the size of the cell body. And alpha motor neuron Y is larger than alpha motor neuron X, but it's also smaller than alpha motor neuron Z, which is the largest, right? The sizes of these different alpha motor neurons is different. And what do you notice? The smaller alpha motor neurons, they travel out to the biceps muscle in our example, and they don't synapse with very many muscle fibers. And the muscle fibers that they do synapse with tend to be very small. And these muscle fibers tend to be what are called type 1 or slow twitch fibers. You don't need to know much about that, but for those of you that maybe know a little bit about fiber types, I'll just mention it. Okay? We'll get to some of it at the end of the lecture. What do you notice about the larger alpha motor neuron Y? When it gets to the biceps muscle fiber, it synapses with larger muscle fibers. It synapses with more muscle fibers. And these tend to be faster twitch fibers, like type 2A, as they're called. They're not the fastest twitch fibers, but they're faster than type 1. And then we get to alpha motor neuron Z. Alpha motor neuron Z travels out to the biceps muscle in its synapses with the most and largest muscle fibers. And these tend to be very fast twitch fibers. So that's the next organizational thing that you need to know before we really get into this. The size principle deals with different sized alpha motor neurons. And the smaller alpha motor neurons, the smaller the alpha motor neuron is, the less muscle fibers it tends to synapse with, the smaller muscle fibers it tends to synapse with, and the slower the twitch fiber. And as the alpha motor neuron gets larger in size, it tends to synapse ultimately with more and larger the larger the alpha motor neuron gets, it tends to synapse with more and larger muscle fibers, which tend to be of the faster twitch category. So now that you hopefully have an idea of the overall organization of all of this, let's apply all of this to what's called the size principle. Basically, this process that ultimately dictates the number of muscle fibers that contract within a given muscle and thus the amount of force that it produces. So we have to go through a bit of an experiment. First of all, imagine you have 3 things in front of you. Okay? You're going to lift all 3 of those things, but at different times. You have a light object, you have a kind of moderately heavy object, and then you have a very heavy object. Let's just make some things up. you have, I'm just looking at the things in front of me. So you have a pop bottle, okay? Plastic pop bottle, soda bottle. It doesn't weigh very much. You look at that object, we've done this before. You look at that object, you say, I want to lift that object up and bring it towards my face. So I need to contract muscle fibers within my biceps muscle. And if I do that, then ultimately I can produce force within my biceps muscle and thus produce elbow flexion and lift the object towards my face. So you're looking at the plastic soda bottle and you observe it clearly. And through this observation process, what's going to happen is, obviously, you know that the primary motor cortex neuron is going to start firing. But what I can tell you is it's going to start firing at a pretty low frequency. We're going to go through some very low numbers because, again, I like to keep things as simple as possible. And then I'll kind of tell you the reality of it at the end. So let's say that the primary motor cortex neuron starts firing 10 times over the course of a second, okay? This is the primary motor cortex neuron that travels down the spinal cord and synapses with all these alpha motor neurons that travel out through the musculocutaneous nerve to the biceps muscle, right? It synapses with all of them. And right now, this primary motor cortex neuron is firing 10 times over the course of a second as you are observing this plastic soda bottle that you are planning on lifting up, okay? If it fires 10 times over the course of a second, that means it's going to release ACH, acetylcholine, 10 times over the course of a second onto alpha motor neuron X, alpha motor neuron Y, and alpha motor neuron Z. It's going to release, let's say hypothetically, the same amount of neurotransmitter onto alpha motor neuron X, alpha motor neuron Y, and alpha motor neuron Z, right? It's firing 10 times over the course of 1 second, so it's releasing the same amount of neurotransmitter onto all of these. Now, since alpha motor neuron X is small, what I can tell you is, again, this is another one of these things that we can't get into all the intricacies of, but smaller alpha motor neurons, it's much easier to get them to threshold. There's a lot less space inside volume, right, inside of a small alpha motor neuron like alpha motor neuron X. So the same amount of sodium coming into it depolarizes it more than larger alpha motor neurons, which have much larger amounts of space or volume inside. Okay? So just take that into consideration. And you say, primary motor cortex neuron, right, that synapses with these alpha motor neurons that travel out to the biceps muscle is firing 10 times over the course of a second as you're looking at this plastic pop bottle, and it's releasing the same amount of ACH onto alpha motor neuron X, alpha motor neuron Y, and alpha motor neuron Z. And ultimately what this will do is it results in enough ACH being released onto alpha motor neuron X to allow enough sodium into it so that it will get to threshold and generate an action potential. But because of the fact that alpha motor neuron Y and alpha motor neuron Z are bigger, it's actually not enough acetylcholine to allow enough sodium into either one of these to actually get them to threshold. So alpha motor neuron Y and alpha motor neuron Z won't get to threshold, but alpha motor neuron X will get to threshold. And now we have to think about, what does all of this mean? If alpha motor neuron X gets to threshold, but alpha motor neuron Y and alpha motor neuron Z don't get to threshold, what's going to happen? What that means is that alpha motor neuron X will generate an action potential, pass that action potential to the 3 small muscle fibers, slow twitch muscle fibers that it synapses with, and these 3 fibers will contract. Now, since alpha motor neuron Y and alpha motor neuron Z did not get to threshold and they thus didn't generate action potentials, none of these fibers will contract. So all you're going to get are, in this example, are these 3 small, slow twitch muscle fibers to contract. But the beautiful thing is, it's enough force. These 3 muscle fibers, it's going to be many more than 3 muscle fibers, right? I told you there's not even an alpha motor neuron that goes to the biceps muscle fiber that synapses with 3 muscle fibers. But you know, it's going to be a very small number of muscle fibers comparative to the hundreds of thousands of muscle fibers that exist within the biceps muscle. Okay, so again, we're simplifying. But what we're saying is these three muscle fibers here are not going to be able to generate that much force. But they're going to be able to generate enough force to be able to lift a plastic pop bottle, right? You don't need that many muscle fibers in your biceps muscle to contract to be able to lift a plastic pop bottle, right? You're going to be able to produce enough force to generate, elbow flexion to be able to lift this plastic pop bottle towards your face. You wouldn't need at all these other larger muscle fibers or more muscle fibers to contract in this circumstance. And the other thing that I can tell you, and for those of you that are really paying attention, this won't make a ton of sense because there's just so much more detail that you'd have to get into to drive all these points home. But smaller, slower twitch fibers, when they're recruited, they're put into a state of tetanus. That means that ultimately, alpha motor neuron X, when it's activated, it generates a high enough frequency of action potentials to put the smaller, slow twitch muscle fibers that it innervates already into a state of tetanus. Which also tells you that the primary motor cortex neuron fires at a much higher frequency than 10 action potentials per second, right? Because we know that alpha motor neuron X would have to fire at at least 20 action potentials per second to get these small, slow twitch muscle fibers into a state of tetanus. And that tells us that the primary motor cortex neuron would have to fire at a much, much higher frequency than 10 action potentials per second to get alpha motor neuron X to fire at 20 action potentials per second. So, there are levels to understanding this material. And I just want you to see the basics of the size principle, but I also like to simultaneously point out that none of these things are as simple as we like to make them sound, okay? The overarching point here is if you look at an object that's very light, the primary motor cortex neurons will fire at a pretty low frequency, and that will only get the small alpha motor neurons to threshold and not the larger ones. And that's intentional because then only small, slow twitch fibers, which mostly because of their size, just can't generate that much force. We don't need that much force to be generated in the biceps muscle to be able to lift a very light object. Okay, that's the overarching premise of this. So now let's keep the pace going. And now you say to yourself, I want to lift a heavier object and bring that heavier object towards my face. Let's say it's a milk jug. Better, right? A gallon of milk, right? You're going in the refrigerator doing something you probably shouldn't do. Done this countless times in my life and been yelled at. You see a gallon of milk in the refrigerator, and you decide you're just going to lift up the entire gallon of milk and take a drink out of the gallon of milk. Well, yet again, what do? You need to contract your biceps muscle to flex your elbow to lift that gallon of milk towards your face. But you're going to need to generate much, much, much more force this time than you did when you lifted the plastic, let's say small pop bottle towards your face. So when you look at this heavier object, what's going to happen is the primary motor cortex neuron is going to start generating a much, much higher frequency of action potentials. As you're observing that heavier object and you realize I need to generate, this is through learned experience, you realize I need to generate much more force to be able to lift that gallon of milk than I did to be able to lift that pop bottle. What will happen is the neurons in the primary motor cortex that control the muscle that you're trying to get to contract, the neurons in the primary motor cortex will start firing at a much higher frequency. In my example, let's say 20 times per second, although it's going to be much higher than that. Okay, so it starts firing at 20 times per second, and it's going to release ACH 20 times over the course of a second onto alpha motor neuron X, alpha motor neuron Y, and alpha motor neuron Z, right? 20 times, right, over the course of a second. It's going to release the same amount of this excitatory neurotransmitter acetylcholine onto alpha motor neuron X, alpha motor neuron Y, and alpha motor neuron Z. We already know that all you need to do is release ACH 10 times over the course of a second onto alpha motor neuron X to get it to threshold. So clearly, under this circumstance, alpha motor neuron X is easily going to get to threshold, green check mark. Okay, these muscle fibers are going to receive action potentials, and they are going to contract. Now, this time, you've actually released enough acetylcholine on to alpha motor neuron Y to allow enough sodium in to allow alpha motor neuron Y to get to threshold. And now alpha motor neuron Y generates an action potential and passes that action potential to these five muscle fibers. And these five muscle fibers all contract as well. Okay, we'll get to what that means in a second. But here's the thing. 20 action potentials per second is still not enough acetylcholine being released onto alpha motor neuron Z to get alpha motor neuron Z to threshold. So alpha motor neuron Z still does not generate an action potential. Not enough acetylcholine being released onto it to allow enough sodium into it, right? So it doesn't get to threshold. But you did get alpha motor neuron X and alpha motor neuron Y. Let's do this differently. You got alpha motor neuron X and alpha motor neuron Y to threshold, but not alpha motor neuron Z. But what's going to happen? This time, as you're observing this heavier object, this gallon of milk, what are you ultimately doing? You're recruiting more alpha motor neurons, right? You're recruiting alpha motor neuron X and alpha motor neuron Y this time. And what does that mean? It means more muscle fibers within your biceps muscle are going to contract because you've activated more alpha motor neurons that travel out to the biceps muscle. Right? You've gotten more alpha motor neurons to threshold by increasing the firing frequency of the primary motor cortex neuron. So now that more alpha motor neurons are generating action potentials compared to when we were lifting the plastic bottle of pop, that means more muscle fibers within the biceps muscle within the biceps muscle are receiving action potentials. In this example, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 muscle fibers now receiving action potentials and contracting versus last time where we only had 3. And additionally, these muscle fibers are larger and of the faster twitch variety, which is helpful for other reasons as well. Okay, so this is going to allow us to generate enough force to be able to lift the gallon of milk and bring it towards our face and take a drink. In the last example, if we only recruit alpha motor neuron X and those 3 muscle fibers are the only ones that contract, we actually won't generate enough force to be able to lift the gallon of milk. We need to recruit more alpha motor neurons so that more muscle fibers within the biceps muscle contract and the biceps muscle as a whole generates more force so that we can lift that heavier object. And now let's bring this to its logical conclusion, which is this time you look at a chair, right? A metal chair. And you say to yourself, I need to lift that metal chair up by producing elbow flexion to bring it to the other side of the room. So in order to do that, I need to contract my biceps muscle. That's a very heavy object. So what will happen is the primary motor cortex neuron will start firing at a very high frequency, 30 times per second in my example. Okay? As you're looking at this very heavy metal chair that you want to lift up and you need to produce elbow flexion in order to do so, and thus you need to contract your biceps muscle, you recognize that the object is very heavy and the primary motor cortex neuron starts firing at a very high frequency, 30 times per second. It's going to be much, much higher than that in reality. And what happens is you easily, as you know, get alpha motor neuron X to threshold because you only need to release acetylcholine 10 times onto alpha motor neuron X to get it to threshold, and you're releasing acetylcholine 30 times over the course of a second onto alpha motor neuron X, so it's easily getting to threshold. Alpha motor neuron Y, you need to release acetylcholine onto it 20 times per second to get it to threshold, but you're releasing 30. So alpha motor neuron Y easily gets to threshold. And now, finally, alpha motor neuron Z. Alpha motor neuron Z, if you release ACH 30 times onto it over the course of a second, you'll release enough ACH onto it so that enough sodium will get in to alpha motor neuron Z to get it to threshold, and alpha motor neuron Z will in fact generate an action potential. So now what you've accomplished with this primary motor cortex neuron, because of its very high firing frequency, action potential frequency, you have now managed to get all of these alpha motor neurons to threshold. Every single one of them. The small, the medium-sized, and the large ones. They've all gotten to threshold. They're all generating action potentials and passing those action potentials to the muscle fibers that they synapse with. So now, all of these muscle fibers are contracting, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 muscle fibers, right? In reality, it'd be hundreds of thousands of muscle fibers. They're all contracting. And by the way, the last alpha motor neuron that you recruited, these are very large muscle fibers and of the fastest twitch variety, which could potentially be helpful as well. Because of the fact that all these muscle fibers are contracting, your biceps muscle will generate enough force to be able to overcome the weight of that heavy chair, and you will be able to lift it. This is the size principle, right? The size principle tells us that when we, are going to contract a muscle, we recruit progressively larger alpha motor neurons as we want to produce more force. That's what it tells us. And by recruiting progressively larger alpha motor neurons with the more force that we want to generate, we recruit more and more and more muscle fibers to contract within that muscle, which enables that muscle to generate more force and lift heavier objects. And additionally, large alpha motor neurons, as is clearly depicted in the image, also synapse with more and larger muscle fibers, which is additionally quite helpful. So that's the basis of the size principle. And I can pretty easily prove to you that this size principle, in one way or another, scientists somewhat debate exactly, again, I say this a lot, but the intricacies of the size principle. But we know that it's overarchingly quite true. Okay, so let me try to prove that to you. I actually do want to point something out first, real fast, okay? Because I'm going to make a point at the end, and this has to be said. So when you recruit larger alpha motor neurons, usually initially you don't recruit them to fire at a high enough frequency to put the muscle fibers that they innervate, that they synapse with, into a state of tetanus. Okay, they produce submaximal force, these larger muscle fibers that are innervated by or synapsed by the larger alpha motor neurons. That's generally true. And then as you want to lift more and more weight and the primary motor cortex neuron increases its firing frequency, it'll cause the larger alpha motor neurons to increase their firing frequency, and it'll move these larger muscle fibers into a state of tetanus. They'll produce more and more force due to the higher frequency of action potentials. This ultimately doesn't change anything about the size principle whatsoever in reality. I just wanted to say this because I told you that when smaller alpha motor neurons are recruited that innervate smaller, slower twitch fibers, they fire at a high enough frequency to put the smaller, slow twitch fibers typically into a state of tetanus. Certainly we think that's not true for especially the largest alpha motor neurons. When we initially recruit those, we almost certainly don't recruit them to make them fire at a high enough frequency to put the muscle fibers that they synapse with into a state of tetanus. You can, with higher intensity exercise, needing to produce more force, one of the things that you can do to cause the whole muscle to produce more force is actually cause these larger alpha motor neurons to fire at higher frequencies to put the larger muscle fibers that they synapse with into a state of tetanus, and thus cause those fibers to produce more force, which enables the whole muscle to produce more force as well. That's a pretty advanced discussion. I would say it's more of a topic for something like an exercise physiology course. But I just wanted to go ahead and point that out to you. You want a whole muscle to generate more force. How do you do it? You recruit, one, just simply more muscle fibers through the size principle. You recruit larger and larger alpha motor neurons, and you get more muscle fibers to contract within the whole muscle. That's going to cause the whole muscle to generate more force if you get more muscle fibers within that muscle to contract. Obviously, size principle is a huge thing. But another thing that you can do to help the whole muscle generate more force, additionally, is move especially these very large and let's just say larger alpha motor neurons, get them to fire at higher frequencies to put the muscle fibers that they synapse with into a state of tetanus. Okay? Because probably when these alpha motor neurons are initially recruited, they don't fire at a high enough frequency to put the fibers into a state of tetanus. And that's one of the things that you can also do to increase the amount of force that a whole muscle generates, is put the larger muscle fibers that are innervated by the larger alpha motor neurons into a state of tetanus. That's one of the things we also know that we can do to cause a whole muscle to generate more force. I hope I'm not confusing you with that. It's not the intention here. It's just to provide you as much context as I can, like I always try to do, without going overboard. Anyways, I digress. Let's now go through an example to prove that the size principle probably in some sense does exist. These are fake weights. Fake weights get used in weightlifting magazines all the time. They are there obviously to fool you, which is what the supplement industry is better at than anything imaginable. So these weights look real. Okay, I've seen them plenty of times myself. They are very real looking. You would never just by seeing them be able to tell whether it was a real 45-pound plate or whether it was made out of foam, which is typically what they're made out of, or some other material. They look very legitimate, and they aren't. They only weigh a couple pounds, maybe even less. It depends upon the one that you're talking about, but they're very, very light. And what would happen to the average person is if they saw one of these fake weights, if they saw one of these fake weights on the ground, they would think it was a 45-pound weight, and they would go to lift it up, and they would think they need to lift, they're about to lift a 45-pound weight, when in reality they might be lifting something that weighs less than a pound. So what would begin to happen is through that observation process, they would look at an object that they think is very, very heavy. And through learned experience, those primary motor cortex neurons would start firing at really high frequencies, because you'd be looking at this really heavy object and you'd be thinking, I need to generate a ton of force within my biceps muscle to lift this 45-pound plate. I need to recruit lots and lots of muscle fibers within my biceps muscle. So the primary motor cortex neuron, in my example, would start firing 30 times per second. And what would that do? Well, it would recruit all sizes of alpha motor neurons, right? It would recruit the small alpha motor neurons, the moderate sized ones, and the large ones. It would get them all to threshold, right? And they'd all start generating action potentials, and you would recruit a huge majority of muscle fibers within your biceps muscle. And your biceps muscle thus would generate a very large amount of force to lift a less than 1 pound plate, right? And you would go over to the plate and you would begin to lift it up, and you would immediately realize, right, you'd be totally taken aback and thrown back. You might even become off balance because you would be putting all this force into lifting a very light object. I think we've all experienced this. Okay? We've all looked at objects that we've thought were ultimately a lot heavier than they actually are. And when you go to lift an object that you think is a lot heavier than it actually is, you recruit way too many alpha motor neurons, and thus you contract way too many muscle fibers within that muscle. And that muscle generates way more force than it needs to, and you're completely, again, taken aback when you try to lift the object and realize that you've generated way too much force. This is an example of the size principle, kind of failing because you've been tricked. You could also do the opposite, right? Where you think an object is very light, but it's actually much, much heavier than it looks. We won't go back through the whole process of this because I don't have time. But if you looked at an object that was very, very light, if you looked at an object that you thought was very, very light, when in reality it was very heavy, you wouldn't recruit enough alpha motor neurons and you wouldn't recruit enough, ultimately, muscle fibers to contract. And you would go to lift this object that you thought was very light, and you would realize very quickly, oh, I didn't recruit enough muscle fibers. Even that's not what you'd be thinking, but you'd say, oh, this object's a lot heavier than it looks. I need to generate more force, right? So again, it's the same exact thing as this with the plate that looks a lot heavier than it is. It's just the opposite. In my fake plate example, you recruit way too many muscle fibers and generate more force than you need to. And in the example of something looking very light when in reality it's very heavy, you don't recruit enough alpha motor neurons, you don't recruit enough muscle fibers, and you don't produce enough force to lift the object. So this was going to be my final lecture on skeletal muscle, but being myself, I spoke too much, and logistically, I need to bring this lecture to an end because it's been far too long. So there's going to be one more short lecture over skeletal muscle as well after this one. In the next lecture, we will finish off some final intricacies about muscle contractions.